welcome. It's just 1 minute past 1 o'clock, and on the 16th of July 2020. So very warm welcome to you all. Thanks for joining us, and for the special interest group Clinical Safety. And this is the kind of joint meeting actually between the Faculty of Clinical Informatics and also the special interest group, and also the National Clinical Safety Officer meeting. First joint meeting we've had. So welcome to you all from different locations. I think we've got probably about we don't know exact numbers, but I think around 60 maybe individuals joining today. So welcome to you all. And I just wanted to run through some housekeeping first of all. And we are recording this session, as you can see. So the recording and presentations will be available after the meeting on the faculty website. We're also asking questions of our speaker using the chat function, if you can use that, rather than raising hands and asking questions by voice, because it's sometimes just easier to coordinate the question flow when we can group questions together. We have had some questions pre-submitted, so we will go through those at the end of the presentation. I'll introduce myself. I'm Sebastian Alexander, chairing today. I'm Strategic Clinical Lead for Clinical Safety at NHS Digital, and I'm also a GP working currently in Cambridge. So warm welcome. I want just the other key individuals to introduce themselves if they could, and then we'll hand over and get going with our first speaker. And if I could also just ask everybody to go on mute again. And I wanted just to bring in Joe first of all, just if you could say who you are, Joe.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Joe Jubb. I'm the Communications and Membership Officer at the faculty. So, yeah, dealing with member-facing stuff and kind of facilitating these sessions.
Jan?
Hi, I'm Jan Hugoworth. I'm the Business Manager at the Faculty of Clinical Informatics.
Thanks, Jan. And then Clive? Clive's there. Clive Tomset.
Hi, Sebastian. Yeah, thank you. I'm just a jobbing clinical safety officer and here supporting you today.
Thank you. Yeah. And so thanks to the team for putting this day together. But in particular, I wanted to thank our kind of key speaker today. I will let him introduce himself. It's David Grainger, talking from MHRA regarding regulation of software as medical devices. So, David, I'm going to hand over control to you, if you can take over control. And I'll let you introduce yourself, who you are, where you're working at the moment, and then I'll let you start the presentation, and then we'll take some questions at the end. David, over to you.
Okay, hopefully you can see my presentation. First check.
Yep, that's
First
fine.
page. Okay, good. So hello, thank you for inviting me today. I'm David Grainger. I'm Technical Lead Software on AI and MRI. I've been with MHRA. We're the medical device and medicines regulator in the UK. I've been with them for 18 years now, mainly in imaging devices, and before then I was a medical physicist in the NHS. So I'm going to talk to you about the regulations for software as a medical device. I'm part of a small team there. There's 3 of us at the moment, and we're quite busy with COVID-related issues. Right. Just need to do right. So we are working to the UK's medical device regulations. They're from 2002. And these are based on the 3 European directives from the 1990s. So there's active implantable medical device, general medical devices, and the in vitro diagnostic medical device directives. So as you can imagine, these are based mainly on hardware medical devices. So they don't really deal with software very well for some issues. So what is a software medical device? Well, it was added to the definition of a medical device in 2010. Before then, software wasn't mentioned. And as you're probably aware, diagnosis and treatment are the main intended uses for medical devices, but it also covers prevention of disease, things like compensation for an injury or handicap, modification of the anatomy or physiological processes, and control of conception. And where do we get details about what a manufacturer intends a device to be used for? So we look at the instructions for use, we look at labeling, and even more so today, we look at promotional materials. So we will look at claims made on social media by a manufacturer. So they might say in their instructions for use, this isn't a medical device, it's not for treatment. But if they're also making claims on their Twitter feed, oh, you can use this for treatment, then that would be heading to our compliance section. We do have published guidance on software. It came out in 2016. It's an interactive PDF document. Although it's aimed mainly at manufacturers, it can be used by lay users and clinicians to guide them to a decision about whether anything they're developing is a medical device. So this is a flow chart that's looking at whether a product might be a device, whether it might be an IVD device, might be an active implantable device. So it's quite complicated determining A, if your product is a device, and B, which set of regulations you need to apply. We've recently updated that last month to include some information on clinical calculators and an update on driving or influencing the use of a device, which is one of the lesser well-known classification rules. So what are the regulatory requirements for a medical device? Firstly, you need to CE mark it, and you need to follow a conformity assessment route. So this depends entirely on the classification of the device. We have a risk-based system from class 1, which is lowest risk, to class 3, highest risk. Class 3 devices are mainly implantable devices, so active implantables, hip implants, knee implants, joints. Class 1 devices are supposedly low risk, and in that case, the manufacturer can self-certify the conformance themselves. The only requirement is that they register with us as the competent authority in the UK as a manufacturer of class 1 devices. So we do have a register of manufacturers, and we have to explain it only is a register of manufacturers. It's just an administrative function. So we do not check any of the technical files. We don't check compliance. We just have a register of manufacturers. For class 2A, 2B and 3, there's increasing involvement of what's known as a notified body. So they audit the technical files of a manufacturer and assess the safety of the device and the clinical evidence behind the device. The manufacturer states that they meet essential requirements. These are in the individual directives. So these are requirements, safety requirements or performance requirements. They're fairly broad, and manufacturers can use standards as a route to show that they meet the essential requirements. They also have to perform a clinical evaluation of their device, and this can be either by clinical trial or by evaluation of relevant scientific literature, or they can do a combination of both. If they're doing a scientific literature route, they need to find devices that are equivalent. So there has to be technically, biologically, clinically the same type of device, and it's a single device that they're claiming equivalence with. we've done that, yes. So we had a big plan. Back in 2012, we started looking at the existing device regulations. There was a need for increased scrutiny of notified bodies across Europe. There was the PPP issues, the metal on metal hip issue, and we needed to review the device regulations across Europe. So new European legislation was introduced in 2017 and was due to be implemented May the 26th this year. That would also have given a additional 4 years for devices that were already certified under the MDD. Unfortunately, COVID occurred, and the European Union have postponed implementation of the new general and active implantable medical device regulations for 1 year. The in vitro diagnostic device regulations have not been delayed, but they were due to come into force in 2022. What was going to happen with the new regulations? So it applies to all devices placed on the market after the 26th of May. And it includes major updates to existing software devices. But medical devices with a notified certificate have an extra 4 years to be in compliance. That is assuming they don't have any significant changes to their device. The new regulations also implemented a new set of classification rules, which we hadn't seen before. Currently, most software just falls into the Class 1 category, as the classification rules mainly cover physical hazards. So they look at things like, is it an implanted device? Is it an active device? Does it come into contact with the central circulatory system? But nothing that deals with software. It's a fallback classification, is Class 1. The new regulations mean that nearly all software will be up-classified to at least Class 2A or above. But existing Class 1 devices can stay on the market if there is no significant change. And a significant change would be a change to an algorithm, but it wouldn't include changes to a user interface as long as it doesn't affect the performance of the device. The other changes we're going to see are that the new regulations would introduce in-house manufacture requirements. Currently, anything manufactured and used in-house doesn't need to meet the requirements of the medical device regulations, but the new regulations would require all development to require a full quality management system. All devices would need to meet the essential requirements of the new regulations as well, and you wouldn't be able to transfer any of these devices between legal bodies. The essential requirements were updated and now included security and unauthorized access requirements. So cybersecurity isn't included at the moment, but the new regulations will. There's a specific software rule, which is better at putting the software in an appropriate risk class. Nearly all medical device software will be at least Class 2A. Again, if a device is up-classified, they would have had to remove it from the market if there was a significant change. Although the regulations have increased in volume, a lot of that has been due to the incorporation of the existing guidelines into the regulations. Currently, post-market surveillance, vigilance, guidance, and clinical investigation guidance are ignored by some manufacturers as their only guidance. And these are now incorporated actually into the regulations as you have to do it. Unfortunately, the delay to the implementation of the MDR now falls beyond the end of the transition period. So the UK won't be implementing the European regulations now, not in name. So we've already started work on that. At the beginning of this year, we started a new medicines and medical device bill was introduced. And this is really an enabling bill, confers powers to the ministers. For medical devices, it is simplifying enforcement powers. At the moment, we don't have any direct requirements, enforcement powers under the device regulations. We have to use other regulations. So the change is going to make this simpler. And we're also introducing civil sanctions that we can apply for non-compliant manufacturers. We're also starting to work on some UK device regulations. If COVID hadn't delayed implementation of MDR, we would have implemented that as a European member state. But now what we're doing is we're looking at the MDR, the IMDRF, that's International Medical Device Regulators Forum, the FDA, the TGA. We're looking for best regulatory practice, and we're going to put options to the ministers to see what they want us to do. This also might be influenced by last week's Cumberledge report, which also had some major recommendations. These were keep a register of all devices approved for the UK market. Manufacturers are required to apply to MHRA before marketing a device. It's requiring MHRA to assess applications proportionate to risk. And it says there might be some grandfathering currently marketed devices. So this is a big change to device regulation if it's implemented as recommended. At the moment, we don't assess any applications or any devices, but this would be more along the line of this United States where the FDA approves devices. Our official line is on our website, and we've just said that we're taking steps until the end of the transition period. And that, I think, is it from me. Thank you.
Okay, David, thanks very much. That's really helpful. There's a quick tour. There's a lot to talk about, isn't there, on this one?
There is, yes.
And a lot to cover in a short presentation. But thanks for that. And what I'd like to do now is we have had a few questions coming through before the meeting, so I'd just like to kind of air those first of all, and then I'd encourage anybody online now to kind of ask any questions via the chat function, so we can try and group those questions together. So I just wanted to start, and I'm just it was a question from John Robinson, which I thought was kind of a good one to start with, really. Not quite sure whether John's on the call. I haven't been through the list of.
Yes.
Oh, great, John. You've asked. My question is: we are using algorithms in clinical audits to identify patients at risk or with a potential diagnosis. They can be reviewed by a clinician. Are these type 1 devices? So this is about algorithms in clinical audit. So their current status and their future status.
Yes, so are these in-house manufactured algorithms? Are these ones that have been built into a clinical system or placed on the market?
So I mean, I work for Primus at the University of Nottingham, and we produce national tools. And the particular one that I'm thinking of is working with the university. Somebody's developed a new algorithm for familial hypercholesterolemia. We run an audit, which we will then share out with various people around the country who want it. And the algorithm will run on the data that's extracted, and produce a ranking, if you like. It actually then grades the patients in order, which allows people to decide where to screen. So it's not directly making a diagnosis, and we've not been able to get a clear answer on this. I'm not going to get one now, I can see that.
It's probably, it does sound like it would qualify as a device. We've added guidance on clinical calculators because we get so many questions about where are they devices, are they not devices. Risk was added to the new definition in the new regulation. So risk of disease and prognosis of disease have been specifically added into the definition. They're not in the current definition, but they're alluded to in guidance.
Right.
So that's probably why you don't have a definite answer. And it depends entirely what the intended use is. You could argue that that is an administrative function and you're just reordering the way you see patients and assuming they'll all get seen to somehow, then it probably wouldn't be a device. But if it's going to definitely change treatment for different patients, then it may well be a device.
Right. Yeah. So it is very difficult to see, isn't it? Because it's not part of the clinical system. You know, it's an audit, and any audit. I mean, if you do an audit and you say, I want patients who've got high blood pressure and high BMI, you're in effect using an algorithm to identify those patients. But I take it you wouldn't regard that as a medical device.
Maybe not. No.
So at what point does the calculation become a medical device?
It's more of an art than a definite answer, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I thought you'd say that.
and we do require all the documentations to make an assessment on this. It depends on the claims that are made. If it's something that's on the market, it's usually quite easy for the manufacturer to say, this is what we're going to claim it does. But if it's more of a research tool, you haven't quite worked out what it's there for, then that's where we have problems. But we're more than happy to take direct questions and assess anything you want to send to us. If you want a definitive answer.
Yeah, I think John, hello. David, that's very helpful. It may be useful if we circulate a kind of general inquiry. So what we don't want to do is bombard you with lots of questions individually, David. So I know there's a central repository for general questions coming in.
Yeah, it'll be the software team inbox.
Yeah, so I think we'll circulate that, Joe, if we can make a note of that, just to have that for the participants afterwards.
Yeah, sure.
So I know inevitably we'll get some very specific questions. I'm trying to keep things very general at the moment, rather than answering specific questions. If I can just keep on working through some of the questions, I think this is. I'm going to take one. This was directly from the chat. Regarding NHS developed software from Owen Johnson. The NHS developed software, does it need to CE mark itself? If so, how? So this is about internal products that NHS may produce, David.
So is that software that's used within the NHS rather than marketed by the NHS? So we've got NHS Digital have already CE marked a number of Class 1 devices, and they're down on our register as a manufacturer. But if it's manufactured and used within the NHS, then that would probably count as in-house manufacturer. At the moment, there are no requirements. They're excluded from the device regulations. But the new regulations would mean that they would have to meet some of the requirements.
So could it's Owen Johnson here. Can I just expand on that a little bit? So Leeds Hospital, for example, has developed algorithms, which obviously it's used internally, and I accept that. However, it also wants to share those algorithms with other hospitals. So now it's the question of in-house is the NHS the trust, or is the NHS all of it?
So that is a question we were asking with we had guidance ready to go up to about March, which we pulled for the new regulations. The whole of the NHS could not be considered a legal entity because trusts are actually legal entities, so transfer it between a trust would mean you are placing it on the market, basically, and you would have to CE mark it.
And sorry, my second part of the question then was, how does the NHS go about being a CE marked manufacturer when it's not in the, as I understand it, not geared up to CE mark? A lot of the regulations that I read said the company, for example.
It's the regulations are applied to the manufacturer. So that's just the person who places their name on the final product. So yes, the NHS can and has CE marked a number of products. NHS Digital have done it already. And that's the same as any other manufacturing want to CE mark a product. Most of these are currently Class 1 devices, so they haven't had to approach a notified body. But I'm expecting that there will be some changes to the in-house requirements for a UK-based regulatory system.
Okay, and just the final bit on that then, I'm sorry I'm labouring this, but so CE marking higher than Class 1 effectively means having quite sort of really good insurance, etc. And that's where we got to with the NHS trusts, is that they feel unable to kind of meet the insurance and liability thresholds.
Yes, so the new regulations do specifically mention liability cover for all manufacturers, not just the higher risk ones. But again, that will be either the change was likely to change under a UK regulation.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to move away from CE marking a little bit, just so Ben has asked a question, Ben Wright from East London, around the, just going to get his question back again if I can find it here. Bear with me one moment. Sorry, Ben Wright. I assume that the standard EHR, so that means electronic health record, still sits outside the medical device regulations. That's a very broad question, but Ben is on the line, so can expand. David, what do you think about that? If you're on mute, David, you might be just gone on mute, David.
Yeah, the record itself isn't a medical device, but in the past, a standard database health record hasn't been considered to be a device. It's just a record. But once you start adding functional parts that do things with the record, then it may become a device. So adding risk calculators in there may change qualification as to being a medical device.
So my assumption, and the way, hi Sebastian, hi everybody, the rule of guide, the rough guide I'm using in the organization is the opacity of the guide. So the rough guide, the rough rule I'm taking is, if I can sit down and somewhat laboriously after a few hours repeat the same calculation myself with a calculator, that's not a medical device. It's a simple calculator. If, however, it's using a rule-based system that is simply beyond direct examination by a human, because it's got neural networks in it and there's a degree of opacity, for me, that then requires medical device regulation.
I would agree. Yes. Yep, so we've added some guidance on clinical calculators that more or less says the same. If you can perform a calculation yourself, you can verify what the system is doing, then it doesn't need regulating as a device. So it may well qualify within the definition, but there doesn't seem to be any point going through the full regulatory compliance when you can do it yourself. It's a let out in the guidance.
Okay, thanks, David. I'm going to keep moving through, getting a lot of questions through, so I'm just trying to pick off by themes a little bit. So I just wanted to ask a question which is on the chat from Paul Campbell. Thanks, David, a very helpful presentation. Could you give us your thoughts on, firstly, how well prepared do you feel the healthcare software industry is for MDR? And the second bit of it was, what's the current position on access to notified bodies? So this is the important one on the notified body question. So I'll leave that with you, David, just the first one. preparedness?
Preparedness for manufacturers, from my view of the market, I don't think many manufacturers, there's a lot of manufacturers aren't even aware of the device regulations. We've seen a huge number of manufacturers registering as manufacturers over the last year. I doubt that they're prepared for the MDR when it was coming. So there was a huge sigh when the European Union announced that there would be they allowed Class 1 devices to continue on the market as long as there was no significant change for 4 years. So that, as to notified bodies across Europe, there have only, I think we're up to 15 notified bodies, whereas at one time there were over 50. I have a feeling that we will be having our own UK notified bodies. We have BSI in the UK. I'm sure that they will be taking a part of that, and they're one of the Europeans' biggest notified bodies anyway. So,
just on David, on that, it just always surprised me. There's only one notified body in the UK, but we've only got one BSI at the moment, haven't we?
For MDR, yes, there still are a few left under MDD, but I don't think they're taking any new manufacturers. One has joined with a Polish notified body under MDR. So yeah.
Okay, thanks. I know some of you are raising hands, so if I could just go back, it's difficult for me to track questions and individuals who raise hands. So if you could put any questions in the chat, and we can try and pick those off as we go through. That's probably a better way of doing things if we could. I've got a general question, David, from actually who was submitted previously. So this is about the important area of AI. This is from Matthew Cook. How is the MHRA looking to change regulation for AI-supported intelligent devices? The basis of AI devices is continuously changing and learning and improving. But present regulations mean that a new application is required if protocols within a device are changed. So it's about change management, really, David.
At the moment, yes, you can place an AI machine learning device on the market. However, each learning step creates a brand new device, and you therefore will need to go through a new conformity loop with every learning step. So we're expecting to see devices fixed when they're placed on the market. They can develop the tool in the background that can be continuous learning if they want, and then they will release a new version because they have to go through a new conformity loop at that time. But they won't be learning live, I don't think. Not at the moment. There is an option at the moment for the UK to introduce specific regulations for AI medical devices, but we'll wait and see.
Okay, thank you. And I think there's a similar question from Ben Brownry around AI triage, around what evidence, from Benjamin Brown, what evidence needs to be submitted to MHRA with regard to approving AI for triage? Is it an internal assessment or done by external assessors?
Okay, so if it's a Class 1 device, the manufacturer has to have clinical evidence, and they can do them themselves. We don't assess anything when they register as a Class 1 device. If it's a Class 2A or above, then the notified body will look at the clinical evidence that the manufacturer has gathered. And that's done, well, it is external assessors, yes, the notified bodies. And that's it, really. We assess clinical investigations in the UK before they start, but we don't see any of the data once it's finished. So again, that's one of the recommendations to the Cumberledge report, is that we assess evidence as well, that we don't at the moment.
Can I just, sorry, it's Ben Brown here. Thanks for asking and answering that question. So just a couple of follow-up ones then. So I suppose in relation to the previous question you answered about these conformity loops. So what does that mean exactly? What do you mean a conformity loop, and what do you mean by clinical evidence? What could you give an example?
So when I meant conformity loop, it's the full loop of conformity. So going to a notified body, having them assess your new technical information, your new clinical evidence. If you're gathering it, then you'll be able to place the device on the market. So I talk about it as a loop, but it's just a process of getting to conformity in that case. Clinical evaluation, you need to show that you meet essential requirements. So some of the device may have clinical performance. So if it's a device for diagnosing a certain disease, so you can't do that. You can't just, you need to have evidence that it does that and it performs as you intend it to. So the clinical evaluation is either somebody else has some data that's been published on the same device, you can use that as your evidence, or you have to do a clinical trial with patients and your device. And from that, you gather that for your clinical evidence.
Sorry, I assume by trial you don't mean randomized control trial, but you mean some kind of other evaluation.
It could be a randomized trial. We have thorough guidance on what you need to do, how you need to carry it out. We had statistical analysis of your trial published on the website.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I'm just sorry. Not to labour the point, but the reason why I asked about the AI triage tools is that so I'm a GP in addition to being a health informatician, and there is a big push at the moment, you know, has been for a couple of years, but even more so now, obviously, with COVID, for us to be using these online consultation tools, many of which do triage. Now, in the previous guidance, it does say that these triage tools are class 1. However, you've now said in your slides that many of these class 1 devices will be, you know, reclassified as class 2A. So, which obviously there's a big difference between doing a self-assessment versus doing an external assessment. So can you talk to that, whether that's specifically for these triage devices, because they are widespread currently and going to be even more so at the moment?
Yes, so the actual clinical evaluation requirements don't change between classification. So manufacturers of class 1 devices should be doing the same as manufacturers of class 2A, class 2B devices. So that shouldn't change, but I have the feeling, and that might be that you don't believe either that they're doing this, because I haven't seen any evidence of them coming to us to run a clinical evaluation on their tools. So
yeah, I completely agree that I don't think there's any that I've seen in practice that have gone through this process. However, I'm leading a project which is hoping to go through this process, which is why I'm asking these questions. But yeah, perhaps this is something I could pick up with you outside the meeting.
That's fine if you want to, yeah.
Yeah, Ben, I think we've saying earlier that there are some very specific questions that we can't possibly, or David can't possibly expect to answer online here. I think that's very helpful, though. I wanted just to move. There are some other questions coming in on, and I've got Peggy Edwards from Wales here, and she's just asking about can David clarify that the UK might not mirror the MDR after Brexit? We are working towards MDR in time for 2021, but now we may need to do something different in the lead time. So that was the first part of the question about the UK regulations.
So I was in a conversation yesterday, and I think there will be at least a 2-year period after we publish anything before there is a change. So we might actually continue being under the present regulatory regime, so effectively MDD based, for maybe 2 and a bit years now before that we're fully implement new UK regulations.
Okay.
I think they will mostly be MDR based with some other parts.
I don't know whether Peggy's there to expand.
Yeah,
on that,
I am. Thank you, David, for all the support you've given us in the past. You have freaked me out now that this thing might be completely different. And, you know, bodies like ourselves have spent a lot of time and money to try and work towards MDR. So I know you can't tell me what's in the new regs. Is it going to be tinkering around the edges, or is it going to be fundamental changes?
I don't know. We're still writing options. You have to remember that the UK were behind a lot of what's in the MDR. We're one of the major players. So the MDR is basically what we wanted as far as regulations go. I can't see us creating a brand new system that's mirroring the FDA. That would need so many more.
Yeah.
It would cost so much just to start that. But who knows?
Okay.
We're just sending options up to the ministers, and it's down to them to decide whether it's going to be patient safety based, whether it's going to be innovation based. We could get rid of lots of the requirements and just say, do what you want. I don't know. We'll wait and see.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Peggy. I'm just going to keep moving through the questions if I could. A question from Maria. Are symptom checkers which provide triage advice only, but no diagnosis required, to increase from class 1 to 2A? So I think we've sort of answered that already, maybe, David. Can we just clarify that one?
I would think, yes, they would go up to 2A,
okay.
if they're a device.
That was my understanding. And then there's another question here from Ben as well. What is good practice? What is good practice in managing the deployment risks arising from software and cyber risks associated with deployment of a medical device with a software element? So a general question there.
That's a good question. We haven't really dealt with cybersecurity at the moment. It's on our list of things to do. Unfortunately, there's some guidance that's come out at European level, but we haven't got that far so far. We do know the NHS deals with cybersecurity very well, and their advice is more than enough for us as a regulatory agency.
I guess what I'm saying here, and Sebastian, you may have a view, is, should we just say to the people in our organisations who manage medical devices, look, where there's a software element, complete DCB 0160. Yes, it's not a software device, but actually the framework of DCB 0160 can manage the software risks associated with your deployment. So just follow what we're doing in EHRs. Would that be seen as good practice? Is that what other people are doing? How do other people manage the risks associated with the software element of their medical devices?
Yeah, and I think, Ben, just to clarify, medical devices would fall under the DCB standards, so would have to follow the same safety standards as other clinical information systems or medical software, health IT software. So I would think that, Ben, it would fall under the DCB regulations.
That seems sensible to me. It's about, I guess, encouraging folk who are really focused on devices and have little familiarity with software to adopt the digital best practice, as it were.
Yep.
Absolutely, I'd agree with you.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're just coming back to a kind of a general calculator question from Paul Campbell again. So this is a very specific example, may need further kind of specific advice, but it relates to something that I'm kind of very passionate about, is kind of various calculators. And this one's about the gentamicin dose calculator. Guidance seems to indicate that even simple calculators would qualify as a medical device.
Sebastian, it's Paul Campbell here. If I can maybe just come in, I put that question in as a hand up to the previous answer. our colleague asked earlier about simple calculators, and I think David laid out the position in simple calculators as being, you know, if you can reproduce that, it's okay. Yet on the new guidance, it seems to give a very specific thing. So, for example, a gentamicin calculator, which I think I could replicate that calculation quite simply, but it relates to drugs and drug doses. So there was just a bit of a conflict in what I was seeing in the guidance and David's answer. I just wanted to explore that with David a wee bit.
Yes, so there's we do mention if you can calculate that yourself, then it's unlikely to be a device. So we're suggesting you do user studies to show that the person who's using it can validate that calculation. We also mentioned that specific requirements for drugs. So that's outside of the guidance that allows this exemption, really. And that's from the guidance. And there is a sort of a gap relating to calculators, apps and medicine. So that's something we're working on at the moment, because we've spotted that there's no such thing as an accessory to a medicine, but we know that people are using apps with medicines placing on the market, and medicines regulations can only cover any advertising in that app. And if it doesn't have a medical function, it's between regulations. So we've got some work to do on that.
Using that gentamicin example then, so sorry, I'm not clear. Does that mean that gentamicin, because it's got calculators linked to specific devices or drugs, are likely to qualify as devices, whatever the complexity of the calculation?
Yep, so if a drug manufacturer produces an app or calculator for their drug, is what it's mean. So it has to be a link with a specific drug by a specific manufacturer, is what we're thinking of there.
What about if a hospital manufactures a calculator to determine the dose of a generic drug such as gentamicin?
Again, if it's their own calculator and they can show that it's a simple calculator, then it may not qualify as a device.
Okay, thanks, David.
Okay. Yeah, complicated area again. I've got a question which just came by email actually just before the meeting, so I'll read this out from Gian. And I don't know whether Gian's maybe still on the call, but if he is, then he can add to it if necessary. So he asks, we understand that the extension granted for current Class 1 MDD product registration is only valid provided there are no significant changes in the design and intended purpose or use of any products currently registered as Class 1. Good software, we all know this, is expected to evolve and adapt, and in order to continually anticipate and meet the needs of the users. Whilst working towards MDR, is it likely that any piece of software will change as a feature, as features are being revised? What is the view of the panel of what test should be applied to assess whether a change is significant, and so would bring forward the date by which registration under MDR would be required? So this is we've talked a little bit about change of software already, David. So this is about change and assessment of that change.
It is. So the EU added this extra extension for Class 1 devices back in December, and they've also published guidance on what they consider to be a significant change. That was published at the end of March for all types of devices. And it's talking about changes in algorithms that change performance of a device. So making it better would probably mean that it would need reclassifying. But there's also a sort of let out if it's as a result of an adverse incident. So it's corrective action that they're correcting a fault with a device. They can keep it as a Class 1 device. Probably not very helpful, but it's there to keep some Class 1 devices on the market. Yeah. But again, we're outside the EU regulatory from the end of this year.
Hi David, it's Richard Ellis-Gibson here. Jan's actually had to leave the call, but I worked with him on that question, so I think that's really helpful. We'll have a look Is that on the EU website, the guidance for establishing?
It is. It's MDCG
Really-
2020-03. If you want it.
Yeah. So you're both cutting out a bit there. I missed the. Do you want to repeat that, David, again?
MDCG 2020-3.
That's great, David. Thank you.
And that's guidance on significant changes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. So I think anything Pacific, we'll try and produce a little sheet with kind of useful links, I think, as well, David. I just had the question from Jonathan Kay, who's new chair. So I'll read this out, Jonathan, if I could. If a device is thought to be a risky one in use, what teeth do MHRA have, especially if that device is then withdrawn? So this is about kind of enforcing legislation. David.
Yeah, so at the moment, we can take action against a manufacturer in the UK if they're a non-UK based manufacturer. So if they're based in Europe, then we would go to the relevant country and ask them to take action. If they're outside the EU, then we don't have any. We can't take any action at all. And even then, we're pushed what action we can take. It's the current device regulations have one real stick, which is we can require a manufacturer to take all devices off the market. So that means they have to actually take them from their users off the market, and then there's very little below that. So the new regulations, so the new bill is introducing a whole range of sticks of different sizes that we can use to use with manufacturers in the future.
Yep.
Sorry, can I say that was actually from Leslie Kay, not Jonathan Kay? No relation.
Okay.
The reason I'm interested in this is for HSIB, the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch. We had a case referred to us of a baclofen pump which appeared to have emptied itself overnight. The testing of whether the device was at fault or not went to the manufacturer. They declared it absolutely fine, and then 2 weeks later took it off the market. So we remain concerned about that, but there's no other route as far as I can see. Will that be better in future?
Oh, absolutely, yes. So that's in the new bill that's going through, which gives us the enabling powers to bring in new regulations.
Okay.
That's all published online if you wanted. I can send a link out on that.
Okay, David, that's great. We're going to give you a rest in a moment. So I want us to take just a couple of last questions, just to kind of some are just picking up from the chat here. There was just one about back to clinical algorithms again, and I think this is an important question around if a clinical algorithm updates its clinical content, will this require re-registering? That's from Kate Elkington. David.
It's a good question. If that is a device and it's reproducing something that's published elsewhere, then it may not need to go through a full reevaluation. It might be that you can just validate that it's reproducing accurately rather than the content is clinically relevant, which would be a different question for that device manufacturer.
Maybe, Kate, for a specific question around the type of algorithm and the clinical update. Okay. Just going to take the last couple of questions if I could, and apologies to all those who've been typing furiously to type out.
There's a lot of typing.
There's a lot of typing in here. But from Maria, can I clarify when the deadline is for documentation to be completed to upgrade from class 1 to 2 to I'm assuming 2A?
Yeah, it was the 26th of May 2020 was, so that's delayed for a full year. But there'll be new UK regulations or enforced by then. So that's by the by now, unless you're planning on marketing your device in Europe. in which case you've got till May next year.
I don't know whether the question is on the call, but does that answers that question, I think. There are many questions coming through online. Now, we do save the chat, so I think there are some specific questions here. We'll try and I'll ask Joe to try and pick out some of the ones we haven't answered so far. I think we've managed to cover off most of those. And I'm just going to pause for a second. So I'm aware David's been now speaking for almost an hour, and I wanted to move on to the next part of the meeting if we could. But I think it's been a really useful session. This is an incredibly complicated area, plus the fact there's going to be some new legislation which I wasn't actually aware of coming out from the UK as we're going to be past the transition period, which is interesting. So there'll be a lot more discussion. I think it would be useful to have a follow-up session, David, at some point to kind of cover off new legislation coming through.
Yeah, and I'm expecting that there will be something published in the autumn, so that will be out for consultation, we're expecting. So do keep an eye out, and you've got a chance to influence what regulation we have or any concerns you have, and we can do something about it.
And is that public consultation?
It'll be public consultation, yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Good. Okay, so I'm going to draw this part of the meeting to the close, if I could. Just a big thanks to David. I know how much work has gone into the presentation and in discussions previously, and in answering the prep questions that were sent through early, which has been helpful. But I think we will circulate a kind of the general email address for any subsequent questions for those with specific questions that remain unanswered, which is inevitable. It'd be a very easy job, wouldn't it, if we had all the answers straight away? We could offer those to you, or it would make our job much easier. But that is not where we are at the moment. So anyway, but a big thank you on behalf of faculty and the national CSOs to David. I've asked David; he's very welcome to stay on for the next part of the meeting, but he may want to go and kind of have a drink of water probably after all that. So thanks very much, David, for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, so thanks for that, folks. We've got a lot of people on the call still, and we're going to move on to the second part of the agenda. We've got about another half an hour to run with a meeting, and I wanted to have time to talk about the faculty and national CSO groups in a bit more detail, and a time just for you folks to answer or ask us any questions and us to answer questions if necessary. So it's time, unlike last meeting, which was very rushed and we had two speakers, we've decided to cut down the session into having one speaker, and so a little bit more time for some general discussion. So do ask questions on the chat line. We'll try and open things up towards the end of the meeting. We've got some time aside just to talk about other items that we've come up with, and the first one was around shared resources and documentation and guidance. And I'd just like to hand over to Clive Tomset, who's co-chairing today, just to bring you in, Clive, just to give a little bit of an outline of our thinking at the moment and what we can be doing as a group between the faculty, the special interest group for safety, and the national CSO group. You know, what guidance is needed out there, what additional information is needed, and how can we best provide you with that support? So Clive, can I hand over to you just for a little bit of a talk on that?
So thank you, Sebastian. So clearly, Sebastian, yourself, Jan, Joe, and many others, we've been talking about where this SIG develops, and you know, just conscious noting that there's 60 people on the call, that obviously there's a degree of interest, and I think what we're trying to do is sort of not duplicate what NHS Digital does in terms of overseeing and regulation. More, could the SIG, for example, begin to start to expand some areas of interest, and rather than 4 people sitting in a room and thinking from their own experience that these particular issues are of interest, this was just an opportunity to say, look, you know, going forward, what sorts of themes would you like to see developed? So perhaps the way to start may be to give you some examples. So many, or all of you are working in trusts or health economies, and quite rightly, you're looking to land the regulations, but equally importantly, create a culture. And with that comes many challenges. And perhaps this group might provide an opportunity to avoid duplication, to share good practice. And I'm very wary about trying to avoid providing templates that show what an exemplar safety case might be, for example. Better perhaps to say, why don't we have a session on walking through a safety case? Why don't we have a session on how you create a clinical management system that brings together influencers, doers, brings in oversight, links to data protection, GDPR, whatever it might be. So I think what we're trying to do here is just sort of perhaps look at a transparent way to start to garner some interest about what types of themes people might like to see. So that was essentially, Sebastian, I think, where we had started. And we thought we'd just use the opportunity maybe now just to say, was there any burning topics that people were struggling with, that they might want some help? Because I'm sure, I found it. I've just taken a new job up on Monday, and surprise, surprise, the same themes tend to be there. And I wonder whether or not, if I reached out, there might be something that's already been done. So, let me give you an example. I'm working in a health economy, and the organisation I'm working with is a stakeholder of a bigger component. So rather than reinvent what might be out there, the first question is saying, is anyone more advanced, and could we go and secure that information? So with that comes things like transparency. So another example is 80-20 rule might apply to something like medications management, to say, what, regardless of the vendor, regardless of the organisation it's been deployed in, 80-20, you're going to come across the same types of hazards. What might be a good idea, and my mantra has always been, what can go wrong with it, how bad is it, and more importantly, who's doing something about it, is to say, when you're dealing with something like medications management, 80-20, these will be the sorts of themes that you should look to address, and therefore begin to start to influence attaining the right degree of confidence over the mitigations or controls that are put in place. So that again, I'm just beginning to spin out some ideas. So I just thought I'd pause and sort of think whether or not this particular special interest group provides an opportunity to take some themes forward. And if indeed that is the case, is through you guys, what themes might they be? And then more importantly, rather than listen to the same people on the meeting, is start to invite people who are maybe a little shyer, maybe as a group, to perhaps lead on some of those themes and begin to share it. I do mention I'm not trying to duplicate what NHS Digital does. What I'm looking to do is augment and build on that. So Sebastian, if I pause there, how best perhaps to take that forward through this group?
And while you've been talking, thanks, Clive, there have been some general questions around terms of reference for the group, for the FCI group. So we can provide those are available, and we have got some national CSO terms of reference which were produced some 9 years ago now. But we have got terms of reference. But I suppose it's thinking about what standard documentation needs to produce. Now, I want to bring in Ben just as because he's had a question and raised his hand and also wrote something down. So Ben, can I just ask?
Yeah, hi everyone. So I think it would be helpful for us to pool some of our standard documentation. My feeling is that the central guidance on DCB 0160 and its implementation is very onerous and excessive. And actually, when we've done an analysis of our risk in our organization, there's very little risk that comes from the actual deployment of the system and the system configuration. Nearly all our risk comes from context, cyber, network failure, individual user error, that kind of thing. So I think that developing a more streamlined process that's actually manageable and achievable is going to be really important, because I know many organizations still haven't even embarked on this journey. So I think
So-
sharing good practice and moving towards something that actually delivers what we're trying to achieve, which is patient safety, would be really good. And I know there are many colleagues out there who've done fantastic work, and I'd love to learn from them.
So Ben, could just pause you there. So interesting you pick that up. And again, I'm just reflecting on my most recent experience. So, and I know the comment about Scotland, you know, I've just walked into an organisation where actually they have, to your point, a range of legacy systems to which nothing has been done. So your pragmatism about, well, how do you actually address something where you've got actually more than 12 different legacy systems across the health economy doing specific things? The ask from somebody like myself was, you know, can we need to do a 160 assessment on each of them? And I think the pragmatism is about having that confidence, say, well, from a resource perspective and a tasking perspective, you know, you just wouldn't be able to do that. So perhaps the better question to ask is, why don't we do a risk assessment of each of the systems in terms of, you know, to your point, exposure, and then look at prioritization? And you know, that's just the theme about lifting good practice, interpreting 160 and saying pragmatically as a clinical safety officer, you know, full-time, part-time, whatever, and my ability to influence, how do I have the maturity and confidence to develop the 160 stuff and speak with some experience, where, you know, you can avoid having your back up against the wall for each corner you turn? Because, you know as well as I do, there are so many stones to lift up, you know, after a while you just sort of, you know, you can sort of just retreat and say, you know, perhaps it's time I stop lifting stones up. And again, it comes back to that theme, Ben, about where we take this group and how we augment the standards and perhaps look at applying maybe some common sense, a degree of pragmatism, a degree of lift and shift, simplification, whatever it might be. And I suppose the reach out here is just finding some of those themes and topics that we can start to build that, to continue the interest.
I mean, I think this group could share good practice, could disseminate things like standard documentation, establish reasonable minimum standards. And I'm thinking here, you know, if you've got a complex clinical system looking after 1,000 practitioners, how many days a week of a clinical safety officer should we be seeing here? Because at the moment, I think organizations are just giving it to someone as part of their full-time job and then hoping that that's enough time, as it were, whereas in fact, we need to set some minimum standards there. And then I think the other thing is that at the moment, the CQC does not look at our clinical safety processes, which is always a bit of a mystery to me, how you have successive clinical safety. And I'm always geared up to answer the difficult questions, and no one even acknowledges my existence, as it were, from the CQC. So I think, you know, should we be supporting the CQC in actually examining trusts when they visit? Because I think that at the moment they don't have the capabilities or competencies to evaluate clinical safety processes. That would certainly put us on the you know, on the map, as it were. And then also, you know, I'd appreciate a friend, you know, a critical eye from a friend to look at what we're doing and going, well, actually, you've not done this, you've not done that, and perhaps mutual examinations of what we're doing, you know, would be helpful, because I think, you know, when you've stared at something for many years, you can't see the obvious.
Yeah. So I think there is a need for, you know, this group to share documentation, and just on the CQC question, discussions have gone on in the past with CQC, and they come back and say, well, they don't inspect against standards per se. They inspect if there's a problem, they will look at the particular standards and whether there's a clinical safety officer and so on. But that I hope will change. There are ongoing discussions with CQC, because it would make perfect sense to include, you know, some simple parameters around the standards, wouldn't it, as part of their as part of their checklist? And that would seem very straightforward, but it's somewhere that I don't think they've kind of have really thought about it in great detail, but we have flagged that to them as an area of concern. But I think more importantly, you know, someone just mentioned north of Hadrian's Wall on the chat here, Ian Bishop, and how does Scotland manage this, Ian? And, you know, there's no the mandation of the role of CSO does not apply past Hadrian's Wall. And so anything we can do south would, would help, I think, for the whole of the United Kingdom. So I think, Clive, on the shared documentation, I think Maggie Lay's also mentioned some comments here about 160 and needing for better practical guidance. There may be a place to say, actually, future sessions should be looking at specific examples, and if we have start developing a repository within the faculty of examples of safety cases that trusts are happy to share, then that's something that could be considered, I think, by the faculty. I don't know any thoughts on that. We're always keen on not providing within NHS Digital template documentation, because then they just get copied and no one thinks about the system adequately.
So Sebastian, just interrupting you again, so I've worked with vendors in the past, and I many of them, incidentally, you tend to find potentially that the effort investment they make in the creation of, for example, the hazard log is such that it becomes a vendor held thing, and that the sort of lack of transparency of sharing it. So as I've done the rounds over the last sort of 20 years, I've generally found that each vendor hazard log is generally the same. So my first challenge here is about clinical risk, is about transparency. So one thing we could do potentially as a group is actually populate a generic hazard log, which will do one thing. It's a starting point to say, you know what, the key thing about doing clinical risk is where the risks exist, and having a generic type of hazard log might be something relatively simple that just starts to give people signposts, and ultimately we can begin to populate suggested controls and mitigations. So my starting point would be, the safety case is fine. It's generally an argument, you all know that. The key document for me is always the integrity of the hazard log and the fact it's completed properly and gives some sort of confidence as to controls. So, my point would be, hey, why don't we start with a hazard log and start to populate it by themes, by clinical area, by, type of sort of organisation, be it acute mental health, whatever. But at the end of the day, we arrive at something that's transparent, can be contributed to, and builds over time. So my call would be, let's start with the hazard log.
Yeah, sure. Okay. No, that the message is coming from the group.
Okay, so that's all very well. So there are now 50+ people on this call. How best to do that? And again, I have my own ideas, but I think Sebastian, myself, Joe, and Jan, we're very keen to make sure it's a shared endeavour. And indeed, I don't have all the answers, but there might be people on this call who have special interests or have specific experience that can actually start to do that. So I don't know, Sebastian, it's just how you go about it so that people feel that what's been shared is actually something that's been generated from the views of many in a coordinated and organised way.
And I think, sorry, there was some echo on my line, so I hope you can still hear me. It's probably my internet, my end. But I was just going to say that it kind of brings us on to the way that these meetings are coordinated a little bit, and the resources and the ability for us to come up with new ideas. Our suggestion outside this call with Joe and Jan and Clive, myself, was to have a kind of steering group of members to try and come up with new ideas for future meetings. So I think one of my pleas to you all is that if anybody's interested in joining us to join as part of the steering group, not only coming up with new ideas, but also probably sharing best practice, coming up with sharing examples of clinical safety case reports, maybe sharing examples of hazard logs, maybe talking about their role as clinical safety officers and their job descriptions. We've got lots of ideas around job descriptions, and there are some examples we've got, but it's something like that. So the idea of a steering group to take this meeting forwards as into the future would be really useful, I think, and it's something that we're quite keen to support, not only from the faculty but also from the national CSOs. So I think it's also important for that. And we've just a question on the commercial suppliers. Okay, message from Richard Ellis Gibson. Perhaps commercial suppliers could supply examples of risks and mitigations, and then these could be populated into the general hazard log, and that's a really good idea as well. So, the idea of individual commercial suppliers sharing information is often very tricky and difficult for IP reasons and marketing reasons. So if we can then do that, that would be really helpful. Maggie, can I bring you in? If you were there, I don't know whether you want to.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Okay, I'm just following up on the bit that Ben writes. I do like Teams because I can remember what people's names are. This is really helpful. And Clive, I have been working for 10 years on trying to work out how 160 works outside of the hospital system, trying to deploy a pharmacy system. It is the most complicated stuff. The documentation from NHS Digital is frankly impenetrable. And we would have had a meeting, but it had to be postponed for various reasons, to look at how we developed 0160. Absolutely, we should be getting simpler, more useful document. 0160 is about transformation and business process change, and it's a thing that, and it needs to be owned locally. So yes, of course, we need to start all the things that could go wrong with using CERN or IHIE, which is what I'm living with at the moment. And I don't want to use their standard log. I want to make certain we do it as individuals and say, actually, you commissioning CCG, this is the risk you own. Do you want to do it? Because we can help you mitigate it, but you're going to have to spend some more money. So all those things we have tried to do with that with total triage, and I know that some of the algorithms are a bit dodgy, but actually say we who've got some experience of total triage, how it's used, have given you some risks, hand over to you. You now own these risks. What are you going to do to mitigate them? So of course we could do that, but it is impenetrable. And I'm noticing Ian Bishop, he's talking about a grassroots movement. I've been doing grassroots subversion for a long time with some people on NHS Futures with Maureen Baker. So yes, let's do it here. Let's actually really simplify it. Let NHS Digital not be sending out 26 versions of the same document, and make certain they're easy to use. Let's involve nurses, and it should be part of what we do. 0160 should be like washing your hands. You know to do it all the time. Everybody does it, and you have some expertise who's your infection control nurse, but let's have everybody doing it. Yeah. So that's why I'm passionate about it. I don't care about the regulations. I care about the transformation.
Maggie, can I just interrupt you? Sorry. So it's
no, that's fine.
No, I'm just going to sort of dissect what you said. Bizarrely, you will find that actually clinically they do it every day. The trick is to say actually there's nothing special about it. You just applied some common sense to your hand washing.
But it's also turning into that language so my experience is we're trying to reduce clinical language into technical language or financial risk, and actually those conversations often get very emotional or disparaging. So this is a properly done hazard log, is a conversation between the workforce and the executive and the technical, and is the single transformation bit about clinical informatics from my perspective.
Yeah, I think it's a point well made, Maggie. And I think one of the outcomes of this will be trying to get a group together, a steering group, to try and kick this work off. And I know we've had some discussions outside the meeting a month or 2 months ago. So I think it's something that we do need to take forwards. And I think there's kind of enough of us on the call and enough comments to support this in some way.
So Sebastian, sorry.
If anybody wants it, I have got loads and loads and loads of really simple documentation based on the NHS Digital stuff for 0160. So if anybody wants any, it's only mine because I did it last. But anybody who wants to be have that and use it as a basis, you're very welcome.
Clive.
So Sebastian, going back to the initial question that we started with about themes and areas of interest and inclusion. We've had a discussion for 10 or 15 minutes. That's great. We've covered a range of themes, topics, inclusion, involvement, professional groups. So how now to take it forward? And I suppose my question is, would the best way to start is to actually ask the people in this call through Joe or Jan to submit some ideas and themes? Then we might actually find that actually there's general consensus on one or two, in which case it makes it a lot easier. And then we can start to develop them rather than spend sort of 1 or 2 months sort of working out what we should be doing. We could just sort of crack on with something. Again, I don't know.
And I think that's a good idea, Clive. I think it'd be good to hear from those interested members of the National CSO group or SIG group who are interested in taking some of this work forwards, because there will be common themes, there will be common areas that overlap and may be relatively straightforward. And I'm used to reviewing safety documents from many suppliers and many NHS trusts, and there are patterns that fall out of all these things. So I think it's something that Joe, can I suggest that anybody who's interested in joining kind of a steering group for this work could email you, Joe? Job?
Yeah, definitely. Hopefully you've got my email, but I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah. Okay. Fine. The other thanks, folks. I think we've kind of sort of covered that. The other area is just to mention is around the National CSO group. Those who are a member of that group, we last met about a year ago, and for various reasons, meetings were put on hold. And so we're trying to have some joint combined sessions with the faculty for the next couple of sessions, really, to see how it all works and to see whether there's kind of common membership, common interest, because I think there's still a very real need to have some sort of forum that supports kind of CSOs who are working out there in their different roles in various trusts. I think it's quite a lonely role, and I see that. And we did have regional meetings some 4 or 5 years ago, but they kind of fell into disrepair because there wasn't anybody kind of interested enough. There were different priorities, but I think there's a very real need for some sort of national CSO chat discussion forum. So that we're very keen on making sure this group continues and continues to flourish. So I kind of do email me individually or via Joe to say, if you're interested in particular aspects. So I think we're very keen on that. So in the last thing, and I know I'm going to try and finish very promptly on time, because there are other meetings we've all got to go on to. But the other thing was for future meetings, our initial thought was to have these every 3 months, which I want to, so every quarter effectively. Last meeting was in April. We're trying to hold the next meeting in October, probably October time. So any ideas for future meetings, do let me know, or Joe Jubb know via the faculty, because we're always looking for new ideas. And I think it's been a really interesting session this time, and always with presentations, many more questions suddenly are generated as a result of a presentation, which is always healthy, I think. So I wanted just to give us kind of a few more minutes just to ask any general questions about the meeting, the group, any general thoughts. So shout those out yourself. I've got a couple of hands raised on the call. Vedi wants to come in, I think. Probably not there, it's gone. No.
Venkat, was it?
Venkat, sorry. My reading.
Hi. I'm here. I think, as you can imagine, with the COVID situation, we're trying to use a lot of digital platforms to help us with neurodevelopmental diagnosis, autism, ADHD, where parents need to record their social communication, play, and upload them so that we can assess them remotely. And there are more bespoke platforms which are outside UK. USA is a leader on that area. and we are really struggling to get that safety shield approval, and hyper regulations are not accepted by UK and trust. Is there any guidance and that support would be really appreciated?
Okay. Do you want to send me any specific questions through, Ian?
Yeah, I will do that outside the meeting.
Yeah, because otherwise we can.
Yeah, thanks.
Tied up. That'd be great. So you've got
Venkat, just on that question, I'm just looking at my list. One of my asks here is to do an assessment of all the platforms that they're using to communicate. So we're talking about we're talking, interesting to your point about addiction services, sexual health. We're talking about vulnerable children. One of them is chat health. And they've asked me to say, look, we're using all these platforms. Are they safe? What are the data protection issues? So I'm doing some of that work. So that might be a theme later on to actually give back and say the experience from a 160 perspective is that these platforms may or may not have these issues, and these may or may not be the controls. So there's immediately an area of interest.
That's fine. I'll contact both of you outside this meeting, and I'm also in Cambridgeshire as well.
Okay, so great in East Anglia. There are some other, just a kind of general. Got 2 minutes, folks, and I'm going to stop probably 30 seconds early about industry. And this is probably a question more we need to discuss with the faculty about industry membership or industry participation. So I'd like to just put that question on hold, and Joe and Jan, we just need to make a note of that one around industry.
Sebastian, sorry, could I just say that we do have quite a number of members of the faculty who work in industry. So that and who are members of the specialist group. So
So so members, fine, I understand, and I know we've got some members and some associate members who are part of industry, which is fine. And is this a question more for industry members who are non-associates or non-members? So I think we'd take that outside the call if we could.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a slightly kind of more detailed question around that, because I know that some individuals aren't always faculty members. Okay. Good. Thanks very much, folks. I'm going to draw this to a close. We've been going for about an hour and a half, and I think this is about the right length of meeting. I think hour to an hour and a quarter via video. I think it's long enough to have a presentation. And any other questions, comments, do contact Joe. If I can put your name forwards, Joe, again, and we'll consider when these are the next kind of mop-up session after this meeting. But I'd like to just thank you all for attending. Apologies if I haven't been able to kind of ask your questions. Probably not being quick enough. Can't read fast enough. There's been generated a lot of questions there, but we will hold those and try and provide some more detailed answers. But thanks again to our speaker, who I think has left us now, David Grainger, and thanks again to Jan and Joe, who've done a lot of work with this, and also Christian Hyde, who's worked from the NHS digital side of assembling the national CSO lists and invites and things, and to Clive, co-chair. So I'm going to close the meeting. Thanks all, and for your time and active participation. See you soon. Thank you.